Okay. Welcome everyone to this first keynote session, which will close with a golden key, the day one of the OASPA conference 2020. We have the privilege to have with us today Anurag Acharya, who leads Google Scholar. For me, as director of SciELO, it is a special occasion for two main reasons. First, because the conference is a worldwide forum on the critical role of scientific knowledge as a social determinant of progress, democracy, and the quality of life. Open access to scientific knowledge, and more broadly, the emergence of open science will improve the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and overcoming the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals, including overcoming of pandemics and tackle climate change. With Professor Rogério Meneghini and dozens of research leaders from Latin America and dozens of librarians and information scientists, we are proud to be among the pioneers of open access when we created SciELO 23 years ago, about 4 years before the Budapest Declaration. The second reason this is a special occasion for me is today's keynote speaker, Dr. Anurag Acharya. He is distinguished engineer at Google. He is co-creator of Google Scholar. Previously, he led the web indexing group at Google. He has a PhD in computer science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I did witness Google Scholar and the Anurag contribution day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, their contribution to the development of SciELO. It was a decisive contribution, and I think it applies to most, if not all, scientific information worldwide. It is widely recognized that over 70% of the access scientific information website received comes through Google. It is also known that the Google Scholar has the greatest geographic, thematic, and multilingual coverage of research-related publications. Google Scholar is open, is inclusive, and without discrimination, as we expect a global scientific information system should be. So we have much to learn from Anurag. After Anurag's speech, we will have about 15 minutes when he will address your questions and comments. Please enter your question in the question and answer panel and mark those you like. Anurag, the Zoom is yours.
Hi, Abel. Thank you very much. And thank you. Great to meet you again. Abel didn't mention how long we have been working together. I think we started working together back in 2002, 2003, back when I used to run web search. My goal at that point was to make sure that you could find everything. Today, the notion that you can find everything is sort of internalized in everybody's consciousness. Back then, that was something that you had to actually build. I had come to Google originally on a sabbatical of sorts, not officially a sabbatical, but sort of a year off to learn how to do things at scale, because this was a very different scale from what academia had ever dealt with. And given my academic background, in addition to making sure we could find everything else, I wanted to make sure that users of Google could also find scholarly information. And then a few years later, when I was sort of burnt out, back then it was very hectic, I took another sabbatical of sorts, which is, can I do something else that is really, really interesting to me and is important and is valuable, but is not as high pressure. And so two of us took 6 months to a year, built a service that focuses largely on scholarly literature. And that was Google Scholar. That was 16 years ago almost. Normally you move on from projects. That's how engineers do. You build something and then you sort of make it work well and then you build the next thing. But it was completely obvious that of the things that I built, this would be among the more impactful. It enables researchers who are solving the world's problems to be more effective. And to build on that, the cumulative impact of making researchers of the world as an aggregate more effective is probably larger than anything that I could personally myself do. And so here I am talking again about Google Scholar. And then give me a second and we'll take off. My goal today, let me get the thing started. Anyways, my goal today is to talk about the two sides of search. First, to be able to find things, to find what you need to learn, to find what everybody else has already discovered. And then second is to learn from it. And to learn, you have to actually go look into the details, to read the articles, to follow their train of thought, and to weave that into your own way of thinking, your own research. The truism that we started from was discovery must be universal. And there are many ways of considering universal. This may seem obvious to the people who have grown up in the web world, but discovery isn't always universal. Often discovery has been tied to access. You can find what you can read. And there is some rationale to it. And for years, many library services, OPACs, have been built with this principle in mind. So that the goal being to not frustrate you. Yes, it is true that you don't get into blind alleys, but hell, you don't actually, that's not what you're trying to do. Your goal is to solve the problems you're working on. And if there is a pathway to help you solve that, you want to find it. Discovery at times has also been limited to discipline. There have been search services limited to specific disciplines. Some of them are very broad. PubMed is a fantastic service, but still has to make a choice of discipline. There are many similar services which, while very useful, will require a user to understand where something might be available. Discovery is often frequently tied to source. There is a notion that only some sources are good as a whole. There's always variation in quality, but quality is a very fuzzy thing to think about. The thing more to think about is utility. Does it help the researcher solve the problems they need to solve? Does it help them make connections that they would not otherwise have? So an exclusionary approach where only the blessed, only the selected can be found limits the progress of science. Some of these are probably obvious to everybody here, but that isn't how lots of groups have actually approached this, at least prior to Scholar. Today, multidisciplinary work is rife, is common all over the place. Groups sort of work across disciplines way, way more than used to be. To solve problems today, you can no longer limit yourself to what is known in your own area. Much of the magic often comes from making connections that were not previously known. And insights definitely are not limited by geography. It is not only in Western Europe and in America or in Canada or in wherever else that people are able to come up with interesting solutions. I'm a child of a place where food was limited. And the high-yielding cereals that fed us came from research in Mexico and Philippines. And that's how we grew up. Smartness is not limited to people who have money. I grew up watching people way smarter than me. I went to schools later that had more resources. That did not make me any smarter. There are major challenges facing all of us today. I don't have to explain this. The problems that travel the world are the reason why we can't travel the world anymore. But there are major opportunities. The world today is connected like never before. We can spread our problems to the world, but so can solutions. To address the global problems of today, we need the global intellectual firepower. We need all researchers on a shared frontier of knowledge. We cannot have smart people wasting their time away, as many people who were at the campus I grew up, working on problems that aren't at the frontier, that aren't having an impact. But what you don't know about, you can build on. And heck, I know about that. I spent a while trying to do very limited amount of research. And every now and then I would run into places where I had no idea going on. I wrote a paper and sent it in about something about designing arithmetic and so on chips a long time ago. And the reviewers came back and said, this is a very nice suggestion, but the constraints that you're assuming are at least 8 to 10 years out of date. Your paper isn't making any difference. I was, of course, an undergraduate, unlikely to make a significant contribution. There are hundreds and thousands and millions of people who are in the same state. Our goals for Google Scholar is to a single place to find scholarly literature, all areas, all languages, and the entire historical archive. Include research from everywhere so that everybody everywhere can find what their peers have learned, and keep it free to all users so that we can bring researchers worldwide to a common frontier so that they can build a common cathedral of knowledge. How far have we come? We have been pushing on this for a while. So that's a good, it's good to have goals. Where does it take you? Today, Scholar is by far the largest scholarly search service. It includes all major and mid-sized publisher societies, most smaller publishers, public ANIs, books, patents, thesis, preprints, repositories, every one. It covers all languages with significant scholarly publication and all areas of research. So how do we make it happen? We work closely with publishers, platforms, aggregators, public ANIs, every single group involved worldwide. For the larger groups, we set up focused crawls to ensure comprehensive coverage. The crawls include restricted access articles, bibliographic information to make sure that the articles can be indexed as they should be for scholarly research. And all users must be able to see at least the abstract or the full first page so that they can at least determine if this work is worth the additional effort for them to make to find a copy that they can read. We work closely also on transitions, on moves, etc., so that when changes happen, researcher ability to get their work done, to make progress is not interrupted. In addition to this, we do a web-wide scan for repositories of all kinds, including disciplinary repositories, institutional repositories, open access. All of this is based on automated identification. You don't need to register with Scholar. There is no notification requirement. It just works. We also monitor for potential indexing issues. We don't have, for most of these smaller groups, we aren't able to do close coordination, but we look for issues that may be blocking the crawl. They may have incorrect metadata, sites move, things break in different ways. When that happens, we reach out. We contact repositories, libraries, journals, editors, platforms, tell them about indexing issues, share solutions that other rest of their peers may have used. This is several hundred a year. We work with so many of people in the audience, so many of the people whose names I have seen here over the years. It's a shared endeavor. We have to work together to make it possible for people, for researchers to be able to find what they need to. We also work with hosting platforms for indexing features so that indexing features are enabled out of the box, so that every single journal, every single editor, every single library does not have to solve the problem from scratch. Most of them do not have the resources to be able to do so. And having them enabled automatically makes sure that that is one less thing to worry about, so that they can worry about making sure that their journal, their repository has the best research, the most comprehensive collection possible. There's a long list here. I won't go over the list. Effectively, it's everybody. We index all formats of articles. Any single way that we can bring to bear. We index all types of articles. We have put in a fair amount of work in being able to handle language, all the major languages. These languages are in the order of frequency of articles. English, of course, is dominant, but Chinese, Russian, Japanese, German, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and on and on. Any language that has a significant set of publications is included. It requires us to basically be able to handle full text. It requires us to be able to identify the citations, the relationships, the authors, and everything else. But that's the challenge of building a global comprehensive search. It can't all be English. It can't all be English and German and Spanish and Portuguese either. The goal is to index full text wherever possible. The goal that allows you to find things other than what the author thought was important when they wrote the paper. Sometimes it is the method. Sometimes it's a lemma. Sometimes it is a caveat that becomes important, that guides you to a new direction. Of course, If there is no full text available, we will index the abstract so that users can at least find this. They can then maybe find different ways of being able to read things. And then, having done all of this, how do we handle all of this diversity? We group at in multiple dimensions. We group all formats, which in some ways seems obvious, but that's not what search services always do. We group all versions. Scholar's probably the only large-scale service that has that many versions available. We group all sources. And part of this will become significant for the second part of the talk when we look at how to actually read the articles. And then finally, after having all of these groupings, we present a single result per group. What you see as Scholar search results are these groups. And I will talk a little bit about how to actually explore the group. But as I said in the beginning, discovery is a good first step. You need to be able to know what's out there to be able to then decide if you need to go after it. But you have to actually read. Access, of course, is a more complicated problem. There's diverse ways of being able to get to an article. For long, subscriptions have been the dominant approach. For a long time as well, open access journals have forged a new path to let everybody, researchers everywhere, learn from their peers. And then there's all the things in between and beyond. There's hybrid journals, and I don't need to go into the details of each one of them. There are many people in the audience who know way more about these than I do. But our goal is to integrate all of these, except maybe emailing authors, so that for the user, for the researcher, for the student, they don't have to navigate all the different ways in which they might be able to find a path. That we find the pathways for them and provide that seamlessly as a part of the search service. The overall approach, as I mentioned, is to integrate access pathways directly into search. It includes subscriptions, it includes open access hybrids, free archives, and every form of access that we are able to work with. There are some forms of access that we are not able to work with, but those are relatively rare. The discovery is the same for all users. The order of results is based on relevance to your query. It's not based on access, and it's not based on who you are. But so that you can look at the results, you can decide which of them is worth spending more time, which of them is more relevant, which of them you need to explore further. To integrate access, which is the second step, first you find, then you read, is to add an additional link to the best available version that user can read. This link is specific to the user. We also add another link to all the different versions, groups, sources, formats that we have found, and make it possible for the user to explore in case that is useful. So what does it look like? Well, you probably have seen it because we don't actually hide it. I have marked out the two different components. The all something version link that you see in every search result is what lets the user explore all the grouped formats and versions and sources. And then from all of those, we select one the best available version to the extent that we can determine as the access link on the right-hand side. In this case, the access links are the ones marked PDF and JBC. The access link answers two questions for the user. They are related, of course, but they occur at different points in the workflow. The first is the obvious, can I read this? So why does it matter? It depends on how sort of relevant the article happens to look like based on the title and the snippet. Some articles are obviously relevant. Some articles are sort of relevant, and some are borderline. So depending on the question is, to click on an article and to read the full abstract on the publisher site is work. And I have to do a lot of it as a researcher. If I know that I am able to read this, my potential return on investment, so to speak, of reading the abstract is larger. If I know I can read this, I usually read more things that are on the penumbra of my relevance or interest. They may be relevant. The title may not be as detailed as it could be. It allows me to expand my horizons without spending a lot of time in dead ends. And the second, of course, is the obvious thing. Once I have found something that is relevant, can I read it? Usually people do a scan. They identify sets of articles to read, and then they go either save those articles, click on the full text, save the articles, or read the articles, then both combinations happen. Sometimes you read them right away. Sometimes you save them for a weekend because you have no time to read a full article in time. Reading an article properly takes a fair amount of time. You gather a few articles, you get a cup of coffee, go off and read them. This is sort of similar to what I used to do when I was faculty. I would print out a bunch of papers or Xerox them from my library because that was my option. Get a cup of coffee, shut my door, slides go away, and then read the articles. Second is the focus here is to help researchers read the best available version. The version that is probably the most vetted, probably the one they want to get to. And the focus is definitely to make this transition seamless. So for that, clicking on the access link goes directly to the full text, not to a login page, not to an abstract page, not to a pop-up, or not to any of the other ones. So the question is, what is best available version? We have referred to it several times. Researchers prefer version of record when possible. That's usually the most polished. It's hard to say, about correctness, because correctness is tricky to gauge in a process like research, which is inherently uncertain, especially exploratory research, but it has had much input to it and likely to have had to be somewhat better. So Access Link will prefer the version of record from the primary publisher if available to the user. If not, the same version of record from a secondary publisher. If not, one of the other versions. How does all of this work? So for institutional subscriptions, we work with, again, pretty much everybody. You guessed that answer. With publishers, with aggregators, with libraries. For open access journals, hybrid journals, and all the other ways of doing this, we work directly with publishers because they are the ones who have the information about which journals have which access modalities. And for free-to-read collections that are on the web, this includes repositories, disciplinary institution, author versions, every other version mechanism. We do a web-wide crawl to be able to identify them wherever they are on the web. The first, of course, is subscription-based links. Institutions subscribe large collections for their users. We index the institutional subscriptions from publishers, from link resolvers, from aggregators, and we match the subscription collections, the journal holdings, to the search results that a user gets. And then, based on the IP of the subscriptions, we automatically enable links so that if you are on campus, if you are from a IP that has access to the subscription, links are automatically enabled for you to the subscribed version. Subscriptions, of course, can change frequently. So this index is updated weekly. Most publishers, most aggregators, most link resolvers currently participate in subscription-based links. This has been in place for a very long time. Hybrid journals are sort of a little bit more complicated to deal with because the journal as a whole is available via subscription, but individual articles are free to read. However, the free to read status is not expected to change. There are many pathways in which individual articles become free to read. The one that most people talk about and probably includes the largest number of articles is where author pays for the availability. But in addition, there are several others. In many journals, editors will select articles, they highlight maybe the highlighted journal article in each volume or something that they consider important, and those are made available. Of course, just like in the current era, publishers will select articles either because of community impact or because of highlighting things that are extremely well known to become freely available. Scholar focuses on free to read availability. Open access has many mechanisms. Our goal, as I mentioned early on, is to make it easy for researchers to learn from their peers. And the key part of that, the main core part of that, ultimately is for learning to happen is for a researcher to read the article. For hybrid journal, this can be marked on an article by article basis using a specific marker. It's a Boolean marker. It's suitable for articles that are permanently free to read. It's obviously not suitable for moving wall access, short-term access, access made available for promotional purposes, and so on. This approach is very effective, used very widely. The next big class, of course, is free-to-read archives, where collections over a period of time are made available to researchers. There are a wide range of configurations for this. As you can see, the most interesting one we found was some anthropology journals, which have a moving wall of 35 years. And I was like, taken aback because of my indexing code actually broke on that. And I contacted the publisher and asked if there was an error there or something went wrong, but no, this is apparently the official policy. And I guess it's basically after everyone who's in the area has retired or some such. Interestingly enough, many journals have sandwich area years also free to read. So the deep archive is not included, the most recent is not included, but then the articles in between on a moving wall basis are included. There are two ways to specify free to read archives. You can do it on an article by article basis, using the same mechanism as hybrid journals to mark every single article when it becomes available. It works well. The downside is that it requires the articles to be recrawled and re-indexed, so this may not be immediately reflected when the change happens. There's a coordination effect. It can also be included in the subscription journal holdings that is used for indexing subscriptions. You can specify an embargo period. And then after the embargo period, the indexing system automatically marks those articles as free to read. Another approach that is becoming pretty widely used is delayed access, often based on funding mandates. Many funders will mandate articles available after a period, and there are many different embargo periods in use. The challenge with delayed access is different versions of articles can be differentially made available. Some publishers will use the version of record, in which case it is very similar to a hybrid journal, except with a time lag. Others would make the accepted manuscripts available because that's what the funding mandate asks for. So if the access is to the version of record, the same mechanism as hybrid journals can be used. You can use the meta tag marker when the article becomes available. But the meta tag marker is applicable to all versions. There's normally expectation is that there is an HTML version, and there's a full text version, and there's a PDF version, and maybe some other format versions. All of them are either available or not available. The delayed access scenarios where only the accepted manuscript becomes available doesn't fit here. You need something else to be able to differentiate this scenario. So usually this ends up being something custom on a platform by platform basis. Partly because some of the platforms will make accepted manuscript available both free to read at some point and not free to read at other times. So you would normally, the one common approach that is used, that has worked well, is to use different URL spaces for the restricted and the free to read cases that allows some form of this distinction, some form of discrimination. But again, this has ended up being custom approaches on a platform by platform basis. And there's, of course, what this conference, this focus is. I didn't leave it to later because it is not important. I left it for later because it is simpler. Trying to manage the diversity of subscriptions and access within them is way more complex. Open access makes all of these problems go away. All the articles are automatically included in access links. Now, if you are on mixed platforms where there are some journals open, some journals not open, then all the mechanisms that I mentioned earlier can be used. Either the ones that are used for hybrid journals or for open access journals. You can do it in HTML tag, or you can do it through the subscription mechanism. If you use it to use a subscription mechanism, it is effectively an institutional subscription for everybody. And there is a way to specify that. And then more recently, there is the pathway of coordinated access, which is referred to as subscribe to open, and pioneered, of course, by the Scope 3 consortium, which is in effect a limited time institutional subscription for the world. So we use a mechanism similar to that. We modeled this as an institutional subscription for the world, but not requiring, which obviously does not require IPs. You specify that everybody is the group of people who have access to this. And then they get indexed and updated weekly, just like institutional subscriptions. The power of this approach is that if this changes, the subscribe to open comes with a caveat that if there isn't enough support in the aggregate, the journals will revert to normal subscriptions. Using this approach allows for a smooth transition if this ever happens. This is, I think, probably the last major direction. Many publishers for a long time have done wonderful work in making selected set of journals available for countries whose researchers would otherwise have no way of being able to get access. Whose funding mechanisms do not provide enough money to be able to do this. It's a fantastic thing that publishers have done. There are different levels of usage. There are different levels of effectiveness. I would love to work together to expand this to the extent possible. The one that is most widely known is the proxy-based approach used by Hinari, Agora, OER, which is today as a group known as Research for Life. This works just like IP-based subscriptions. Each country has a proxy IP, and therefore it becomes a subscription at every publisher with the proxy IP as the institutional IP. So if the users are coming from a proxy, you see subscription-based links just as you would if you happen to be on campus for a subscribing institution. So that is the simple, easy, integrated, good part of it. The downside of the proxy-based approach is that each institution has one login. And you as a user have to know that login password. Having grown up in places like this, I know that my likelihood of being able to get access to that institutional password when I was there is 0. This level of information is power, and it is wielded with care. The second approach, which is more effective, is to provide free or lower cost subscriptions to institutions in selected countries. There are normal subscriptions with normal IP-based subscriptions. Everything works exactly like institutional subscriptions, a seamless access, just like peers. They don't have to know about proxies. They can do what Harvards and the Stanfords and the MITs of the world can do. It's definitely way more effective than proxy-based access, because you don't have to be in the know the people that have the power. But the most effective approach has been country-level subscriptions. The idea here is to use IP to country map that are widely available for a variety of purposes and used by most platforms for many, many things, including personalization, localization, and whatever, instead of institutional IPs. So there is an extension of our subscriber link mechanism where you can specify a list of countries instead of a list of IPs. And the users, we use a similar IP to country map to determine if the user has access to the subscription and provide access links in the same way. It's supported by several platforms, has been for a long time. And since it helps all researchers, all students in the country, it is by far the most effective. If you come from, I come from India. The major institutions have access to way, way more. There's like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then if you are out of tier 1, it's shit out of luck. This brings everybody in. Preprints, repositories, these are, as I mentioned earlier, automatically identified in a web-wide scan. All the full text articles from all of these collections are candidates for access links. They are selected if they are the best available version for that user. I would like to end almost on time with a few sort of notes. People complain today about information glut. And it is definitely a challenge in many, many ways. But Lord, it is so much better than the information famine that many of us grew up with, where you didn't have to take a train journey for 3 hours to find a full-size library. The era of connectivity brings its own challenges, brings disinformation, brings all kinds of issues. But it does not fragment the frontier of knowledge. It does not require you to take a plane journey to a different country to be able to join your peers in solving the world's problems. The era of rapid change is always a challenge. You always have to reinvent yourself. You have to do things differently. The churn is difficult. But the alternative is to be in an era where nothing changes. The world after you leave it would be the same the world that you found it. It's a change that allows us to leave the world a little bit better, and no one can ask for more. Thank you.
Thank you, Anurag. Hi, my name is Claire. I work for OASPA and I'm helping Abel with the questions for this session. Thank you so much for that wonderful and passionate presentation. We're so grateful for your time speaking today. There have been a lot of questions coming in while you've been speaking, and I'll try to get through as many as I can. Are there plans for Google Scholar to index other available scholarly outputs, so data, code, and methods, and things like that?
No, Scholar's focused on research articles. There are several reasons for this. They are largely falling into two different classes. First, at Google, I have to define a boundary for what a separate search service that is not web search is to be. It can't be everything that is of interest to researchers. So there has to be some boundary. That doesn't say the boundary has to be research articles. The boundary that you pick has to allow for two things. First, it has to allow all the items to be findable by being rankable in a similar way. The reputation mechanisms have to be in place. The ability to determine which ones are more relevant than others has to be in place. This is today not in place for any of the other data types, and that's a challenge. Second is an issue of what does the user expect when they come to a search service? And what do the user conclude if they don't find something? If you can choose to add, the challenge for not including some of the other formats is that formats are not comprehensive. You can get some data, you can get some code, you come in and search for it. If you don't find it, is that not present? Is that not available? You can't tell. And the final thing is that in the end, if you want to get into data, if you want to get into code, if you want to get into anything, that is after you have found the article to be interesting. If the article is not interesting, if the result is not important, if it does not change the way you think or does not need to take into account, then the rest of it is not relevant. So the many, many reasons we have ended up with articles. We have tried to expand that. We do dissertations, we do reports, we do a variety of different article-like things. But going beyond that is as yet beyond the scope.
There was another question which is kind of related on what you decide to include. So you use the phrase significant scholarly output, and there was a question about the threshold or methodology for how you determine that.
That's a good question. There isn't a simple answer to this. There's several pages of code trying to do that. But you try to estimate. But that is not actually giving you a feel for what it is. Let me at least try to describe what the intent is. The intent is to try to say, if you as if a group of researchers, if they expect that to be scholarly, then you would try to include it to the extent possible. Now, the challenge there is to see what does the field consider scholarly, and that remains. There isn't a clear-cut answer to provide as much as it would be good to be able to do that. The intent largely is to try to make the decision as each of the fields would normally do.
Okay. How does Google Scholar deal with fraudulent scholarship? So retracted studies, hoaxes, or predatory journals that may not be doing the peer reviews that they say they do. Can you speak to that?
Could you, there's some breakups. I heard the word predatory journals, and then I had something else which
retracted studies and hoaxes. Sorry, it could be my connection.
So retracted studies, we index, the retracted studies are indexed just like any other articles because they will be retracted at the publisher. If they are no longer available at the publisher, they will go away from the index. I want to make one thing clear. Scholar is a search service. It's not a database. It indexes what is available in the scholarship space. It does not have its own set of, so what we call ground truth. So if the articles are no longer available, then they will no longer be available in Scholar. If articles continue to be available with a retracted marker, then they will continue to be available, they will be displayed in search results with a retracted marker.
Okay. There was a slightly cheeky question, which was, if Google Scholar is so great, why isn't everyone using it as they do with Google for their web searches? And I thought perhaps you could talk about plans you might have for increasing usage in the future.
No, those are two different questions.
Okay.
I'm happy to address them independently. At least from the way where I stand, those are two very different questions. Google is very different. You use it for purpose is very different. I used to work on web search. You use web search for everything. And much of it you can actually read and follow, and that everybody can often follow a lot of the things that you can read, and it's you make decisions, you decide where to go, you decide what to learn, whatever. Scholar is the expert output. You have to know enough to be able to read and follow. It's not suitable for every question. It's not suitable for all areas. Today, when I try to look into papers in school, I don't make sense out of my wife's papers, leave alone anything else. So it's not an issue of A being better than B, it being different purposes. The purpose of Scholar is to help you find research work for the purpose of learning in the research context. The purpose of Google is everything, to answer, hopefully, as many questions as possible.
Thank you. We have had so many questions that we don't have time to get through them all, and I'm hoping that if we send you the list, perhaps you can answer some of those afterwards, but I'm going to stop here so that I can hand back over to Abel and then Jennifer after that for closing. Thank you, Anurag.
Thank you. Thank you.
Abel, did you want to offer just a couple of remarks before we close up?
Yes, I would like, of course, thank you very much, Anurag, for his presentation, which shed light to the strategies, concepts, and the algorithms behind Google. I have, of course, the challenge in the near future that the open science generates many research communication objects, and how are you going to extend the multiversion to multiple objects? But that is for another conference. Very much like to meet you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Abel. Thanks, Anurag. So just want to wrap up the day, everyone. Thank you so much for a fantastic first day of the OASPA meeting. We really went off like a rocket, and it's just been so wonderful to have everyone so vocal on the chat and Slack on Twitter. So just want to encourage you to carry on the discussion overnight. For those of you who are not deep into your evenings, Asia is going to be waking up in several hours, so they're going to want to hear what's gone on today. So do stay on Slack and Twitter according to your time zone, and we'll see you again on Wednesday at 11:30 in the morning British summer time for our first session of the day, which is small and scholar-led publishers, the lessons that they can teach us, with speakers from Japan, Brazil, France, and South Africa, followed by our first round of lightning talks. So check Twitter for the latest, check the website for the full program. Thank you so much. Anurag, thank you. Abel, thank you. Claire, thank you. And see you guys tomorrow.